Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
We're witnessing one of the largest shifts in global geostrategic power that the world has witnessed. And if we, the United States military, don't do a fundamental change to ourselves in the coming 10 to 15 to 20 years, then we're going to be on the wrong side of a conflict.
My guest today is defense strategist and best-selling author Elbridge Colby. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, in which capacity he was responsible for defense strategy, force development, and strategic analysis for OSD policy. Prior to entering government service, Colby was the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. Mr. Colby is also the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. He is the author of a great deal of literature, including reports and articles on defense and foreign policy issues. He also co-edited a volume on strategic stability and has testified before Congress and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. His most recent book is The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of The Strategy of Denial, Dan Blumenthal of the Wall Street Journal says, rigorously argued and compelling, this book will define the basis for future debate about U.S. defense strategy in Asia. Mr. Colby earns a place as an intellectual heir of the Cold War strategist who thought seriously about thwarting Soviet designs. He is courageous in forcing readers to think concretely about the unthinkable. The task of deterring Chinese aggression is urgent, and Mr. Colby's book presents a needed path forward. And we are very pleased to have the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and best-selling author with us today. Welcome, Mr. Colby.
Great to be here with you, Rob.
The United States found itself as the world's only remaining superpower after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. That's simply not the case today with the rise of China as an up-and-coming superpower. Does America now need to look at those tired old strategies and develop some new, innovative, modern defensive strategies to face the threats that we see today?
Well, absolutely. I think you're right. You put it well. I mean, we are, a lot of these things we thought was old hat, had gone by the wayside, was no longer relevant at the end of history in the 1990s and 2000s. And the problems were terrorism and all these other kinds of things. But unfortunately, history has had a way of coming back. And I think you're right that a lot of that quote unquote old strategic thinking, well, a lot of things that are old are tried and true for a reason. I mean, they make a lot of sense. And I think that's what we got to do is kind of get back and think rigorously about what it is we need to do in the world to serve, Americans' interests or freedom, security, and prosperity. And focus on that and develop the strategies that correlate the resources that we actually have available to deal with the potential threats out there, and then do so in a way that's consistent with what the American people are prepared to support.
Bridge, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Cold Snap White Ale from Samuel Adams. The crisp character of this lively, unfiltered white ale gets a kick from a bright blend of spring spices. Orange peel and plum add subtle sweetness, while coriander contributes a peppery bite, creating a refreshing flavor that signals spring may not be here now, but it will be on the way soon. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. This is also my opportunity to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Subscribing is the only way to get the newest episodes right away. And to the list and legion of listeners from more than 80 countries and 2,000 cities from across the globe, I would like to say thank you. And now, I raise my Cold Snap White Ale very high. And to the strategists and planners who prepare for our darkest outcomes to bring us a brighter future, I say cheers. You talk about in your book how the United States for many years would just simply throw resources at a problem. And in some cases, it was even simpler than that. They would just throw money at a problem. That is not a comprehensive strategy. And as you point out in your book, it's just not possible for the United States to do that as they had done it in the past. But I'm wondering, though, is this actually an opportunity? Could this actually force us to get away from those lazy ways of thinking of things, becoming more creative? In our history, there's, tons of situations where Americans were challenged and that creativity comes through. So while it might be a challenge now, it may be an opportunity for us.
I think it is an opportunity. I've had that view over the years, but I've been disappointed in a lot of ways. For instance, during the sequestration era in the early 2010s, the defense budget got cut, and I thought, well, maybe this will be an opportunity for innovation to be spurred. The problem is it sometimes happens, but often it doesn't. Oftentimes in periods where there's sort of privation or a loss of a lot of resources, people kind of, go to their corners or take cover. And, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book is I don't think we can just kind of go along, as if things haven't changed and just try to kind of paper it over. We've got to actually be deliberate and strategic and rational. At the same time, I think you're right. I mean, you look at our history. George Washington didn't have a lot to work with. And, the Navy in the early years in the Pacific in World War II didn't have a lot to work with. So it's definitely within our power and our ability and our traditions. But I don't think it's a given, unfortunately. And again, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book.
Now, the war on terror was costly for the United States in blood and treasure. I took part in that. But on a global scale, did China then use that time that the United States was distracted with their focus on the Middle East or these terrorist organizations to then solidify their position in Asia?
Absolutely. I mean, they took great advantage of us. I mean, there's no evidence, and I have no reason to think that they were actively involved in 9/11 or something, but they certainly profited from it immensely. In fact, the defense strategy of early 2001, after the Bush administration had been elected, was actually pretty focused on China because people were appreciating that China was going to continue growing, that it was eventually going to present a challenge. And so, 9/11 in some sense was a godsend for them because not only did we become involved in the Middle East, but we became involved in a way that was, I think, way beyond what was prudent or necessary. Not obviously, but I think the mission to go after Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and to punish the Taliban and make an example was absolutely right. But then, we got into the war in Iraq and the expansive nation building mission and these ideas that we were going to stabilize the Middle East well beyond, what was necessary or what we were really capable of doing. And we spent tremendous resources and attention on that. Meantime, the kind of warfighting elements, the high-end warfighting elements, the military and our mindset, our muscle movement on that really kind of atrophied. We kept building things, but we really took our eye off the ball and sort of took our advantage for granted. Let's look at it from this way. If you're a rising power like China, you could not have had a better kind of hegemon or ascendant power than the United States, because not only did we get involved in all these wars in the Middle East and not to mention the Balkans, but we pursued this economic policy and trade policy that basically involved allowing the Chinese to steal from us, deindustrialize without any being held to account. At least notionally, when they were admitted into the WTO, they were supposed to abide by those rules, which they didn't, and we didn't hold them to account. Apparently, President Bush, his policy on China was, I don't want to hear about it, which it's literally like the best situation that China could have faced. Now, paradoxically, and Edward Luttwak makes this argument in his book on China, which, is brilliant strategist, but what saved us in some sense was our disaster, for instance, in the financial crisis, because the Chinese then got arrogant. And I think they got out of the box too early. I can say this openly because I don't think they can go back into the box now. But with 2008, with things going poorly in the Middle East, I think they came out too early. This started under their last leader, Hu Jintao, and then has really accelerated under Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. And they showed their true colors so that we could start to adapt. And in fact, the Obama administration, I think it was too soft on China, but in a sense, that sort of induced them to become more aggressive, which allowed the shift, which was, too late, but it at least allowed a resolute shift that started really in 2017.
Taiwan has been on the mind of the Chinese Communist Party from their inception, so I can see why gaining full control of Taiwan is important to them. But for the United States, how would you convince the American people of the importance of Taiwanese autonomy?
Right. Well, it's a great question. I think it's not obvious in the slightest. In fact, if you just look at it in a vacuum, it's pretty hard to understand why we would care about Taiwan. So I sympathize. I kind of come at it from that point of view. But I mean, I think people might be interested in a piece I had in National Review arguing this exact point, because I don't actually really go straight at it in the book in like one place. So it might be of interest. But I think that, look, the reason for us to defend Taiwan is actually in our interests. And I don't mean that in some kind of hand waving way. I mean in a concrete way. Because, look, at the end of the day, what we're really worried about is China dominating Asia, because China's a mammoth of a state. It's about 20% of global power. Asia is going to be about 50% or more of global GDP. So Asia is going to be the center of the world, in terms of like the country. If a country can kind of dominate that market, it's going to have immense power. It's going to shape all of our lives. All this stuff with LeBron James or Hollywood, this is just a taste of what's going to come, because they're going to be the dominant actor. It's going to be like the United States after the end of World War II with a much different, approach. So we can't allow that, right? It's not in our interest. The only way we're going to be able to do that, we can't do it by ourselves. We're not strong enough. We're as strong as China, but we're a long way away from Asia, is working with Asian countries to stand up to China. Countries like Japan, India, Vietnam, Philippines, Australia, South Korea. So that's going to be a coalition effort, because none of those countries is strong enough on its own to stand up. They're all going to cut a deal if they're left alone, right? And we got to remember that these countries, they want to stand up to China, but they don't want to be fried under the microscope by China, because China's best strategy is not to take on everybody at the same time like Hitler did. Its best strategy is to make an example of a few of them and then cause a run on the bank of this coalition. And people say, I better cut a deal now because I don't want to be punished by China. So if that's true, I think it's pretty clear, and that's kind of happening, then we got to show that this coalition, and particularly the United States, because only America is strong enough for countries to bank on, to stand with them in the face of Chinese pressure, right? I mean, I'm not saying this from a kind of an emotional point of view that America's special. I mean, I think it is. I love America. I'm a patriot. But, if you're a Filipino or a Korean or a Japanese, that's not the point. The point is only America is big enough to stand up to China alongside you. So you got to be trusting America. And that's where Taiwan comes in. I would say there are three reasons. One is we are committed to Taiwan. We're not a formal treaty ally, but everybody in Asia, for a variety of reasons, historical reasons and other, sees our credibility is on the line with respect to Taiwan. So if we don't defend Taiwan, if you're in Manila, Seoul, even Tokyo, you're going to wonder whether we're going to pull chocks when it gets too hot. And that's not unreasonable. I mean, look, we had a lot of commitments to Taiwan. The Biden administration says it's rock solid. Well, if we cut them off, why do we think the Philippines is, if you're in the Philippines, it's so special? And if that happens just 2 or 3 times, it could cause that run on the bank I'm talking about, collapse the whole thing, because it's pretty narrow. So I think we've got an important credibility argument. And I want to stress that I don't think that, countries aren't going to say, oh, the Americans got out of Afghanistan, I don't believe them. No, it's different. It's different when it's your neighbor, when it's about the Chinese, how the U.S. behaves towards the Chinese. I think of it as a kind of a differentiated approach to credibility. It's more contextual. The second argument is Taiwan is militarily significant. And, I think you've served. I mean, look, the reality is the United States' strong suit, particularly in Asia, is aerospace and maritime. Our defense perimeter, the countries that are with us tend to be islands and peninsulas. And that's for a pretty simple reason. There's a lot of wealth there. There's a lot of power, but also, you don't want to get in a ground war in Asia, right? That's a bad idea. We've had really bad experiences with that. So if China takes Taiwan, they're not going to stop. They're going to militarize the island and project power from beyond. And that's going to really jeopardize our position in places like Japan, certainly places like Korea and the Philippines. People like to say, well, Taiwan's 100 miles from China. Well, the island of Luzon, the primary island of the Philippines, is 100 miles from Taiwan. South Korea is 100 miles from China. So we got to hold the line over there, because there's nothing really in the Central Pacific. There's just a bunch of little islands. So I think it's militarily significant for our position. The third reason, I think, Rob, is our alternatives are actually worse. So there's kind of an argument often when people say, particularly kind of more realistic minded arguments about why we should cut off Taiwan. Hey, it's too hard. It's too, the Chinese have too strong of a claim, et cetera. And it's like, okay, well, if we lose, what's one of the 10 largest economies in Asia, that's very militarily significant. And if we cut it off, everybody's going to be wondering whether, we're good for our word. We're going to have to do some other things to compensate, right? It's going to be a dynamic situation. So what are we going to do? Who are we going to add? Well, all the islands in that area are already with us. So we're going to add Vietnam. Well, Vietnam shares a long land border with China. I mean, are we going to add Thailand, which is kind of tilting towards China anyway? And what are we going to have to do to persuade them? They might not even be interested. Otherwise, if we're just on our back hunches, the problem's just going to be come at us more and more. And so I think that's another reason. The key here, Rob, though, is defending Taiwan is not an existential interest for Americans, right? It's a strong interest, it's a potent interest, but it's something that we should be willing to pay a certain price for in resources and, let's be honest, in lives too, but not beyond a certain point. And that's kind of inherently subjective. But what I tell the Taiwans when I talk to them frequently is you've got to work with us to keep the cost and the risk of defending Taiwan down below that threshold. Because we might be prepared, in Afghanistan, we were prepared to stay around for a long time. In South Vietnam, we were prepared to, but at a certain point, we say it's just not worth it. And that's, what's critical in a big part of my book, or really a central part of my book, is trying to figure out what's the strategy that allows us to do that. Because it's not really a totally binary situation. It's something that it's a very important interest that we should be willing to fight for, but only up to a certain point and in the right way, in a sense. And that's what I think what we need to focus on a lot in the defense conversation.
How important to the Chinese is their image as a superpower? Because it seems like they would like to use that to positively affect outcomes for them just through intimidation.
I think it is. I mean, I think, they are certainly what we can tell from their kind of propaganda and official statements, they really emphasize, and Xi Jinping himself heavily emphasized, what's called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So the standard narrative of the People's Republic of China is that China entered what's called the century of humiliation because of the decadent empire, the Qing Empire, the old, imperial system, and it was exploited by the Europeans and the Japanese, and to a lesser extent, the Americans for 100 years. You had these humiliating treaties after the Opium Wars, the concessions, the loss of Hong Kong, all these terrible things, the burning of the Summer Palace, and then the Japanese invasion, which was horrible and brutal. And that the communists won the Civil War. And what they say is that with Mao Zedong and the proclamation of the People's Republic, he said the Chinese people have stood up. So they had ended that kind of humiliation. And then with Deng Xiaoping, they became, and the opening up, they became more prosperous and sort of rose to another level. And what Xi Jinping is saying is that essentially we're going to become the world's greatest nation again, which, the Chinese know that for many centuries, China was the world's most sophisticated and probably powerful civilization. Obviously, everybody wasn't in such contact back then. But I think that image is very important to them, and that restoration of their dignity. So that's dangerous in the sense that it shows a lot of their ambitions and how great those ambitions are and how domineering it is. It also is, though, they have to be careful about that, because if they reach and they fail, there are going to be consequences for the leadership there and for China as a whole. And so I think that's something that we need to be conscious of. On the other hand, I would also say it's something that we can, and I conclude my book in this note, which is, I think we should acknowledge China as a great nation, which, I detest communism, but we have to acknowledge that China has stood up and has become, again, a great nation that deserves to be respected in so many ways. And I think that that's something that we can afford to China without compromising our interests in a way that will give them a stake in kind of a balance of power, as opposed to sort of a feeling that they have to overthrow the whole system that exists, or that we can prepare, or we're going to change the system that we can live with.
The situation almost seems like a football game where, at least currently, the Chinese are always playing on our half of the field, if I can make a football analogy. The lack of focus that the United States has had on Asia has allowed that to happen. And we have to figure out a way, because all of the things that we're trying to do now, we just can't flip the field. It's like they're constantly playing on our half of the field from the 40-yard line in. We got to figure out a way, even if it's a punt in some ways, to get this field flipped so we're playing on their half of the field.
Yeah, I think we've got to sort of really focus on China and Asia. It's something that we're kind of just looking all around the world, and we're kind of operating on the idea that everything is sort of equivalently important, and that's just not true. We have to get in there And in a sense, we've got to, I actually think like the schoolyard is maybe another analogy, which is, we're the big kid, the 12-year-old, but they're the other big 12-year-old. And we're kind of getting in, staring down a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a scrawny 10-year-old. And meanwhile, there's this 12-year-old who's kind of intimidating everybody to be on his team. And we're kind of ignoring that problem. And that's the kid, that 200-pound 12-year-old is the one you really got to make sure you got to take care of. And that's what we've just been neglecting it. And people are going to make, Asian countries are going to make their calls even in the coming years. It's going to be a long-term thing, but it's also a short-term thing. They're going to say, look, do I want to stick my neck out and risk getting pummeled by the Chinese, whether that's directly with military force, could also be economic sanctions. I mean, the Australians are putting up with a lot right now. So it's totally plausible. And that's what I think we really need to kind of focus on.
In my opinion, our most important resource is actually American democracy. I believe that's the key. Inherently, I believe that people want and yearn to be free, and the Chinese don't afford that opportunity. That's just a simple fact. I think if we can foster those democratic impulses wherever they might be, and they may not be as overt as, say, Hong Kong, they may be in art or in music or the things that we did during the Cold War to kind of get the soft underbelly, make them focus on their internal problems so they can't exert their power so prominently on their external situation.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bit of a different view. I mean, I love living in a republic. I want to be free. I want a representative system of government because I think that's the best morally. I'm not totally convinced it's the most effective, particularly in like strategic competition. In fact, I think it's something that the founders reckoned with a lot. They were quite concerned about the ability of republics to be effective at strategic competition. In fact, I think it was one of the arguments that they made for ensuring that the republic was large enough was because these little city-states traditionally had been gobbled up by empires that at the time monarchical systems were seen as more efficient because they had centralized control. And that's one of the reasons that I think foreign policy is really vested in the presidency because it had this element. I think Hamilton was very keen on this point. But that's all to say, I mean, I don't think we can take that our system will outcompete China sort of for granted. I'm not suggesting you are, but I think that's something we're going to have to strive for rather than take for granted. I also think, even if China did become a democracy, I think we'd have a lot of problems with it. I don't think the exclusive or even primary source of our troubles with or our difficulties with China is necessarily democratic because or rooted in their ideology, because I think their interest, they have a strong nationalist sort of desire to impose their will beyond. And I think it actually probably, who knows, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's not widely held by the Chinese population. I mean, it's been interesting to see the Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, Putin doesn't run free and fair elections, but there is clearly strong support. Even Navalny, the opponent of Putin, is like a kind of a Russian nationalist, as far as I understand. So these things can be quite popular. So I think we'd have a problem. That all said, I think the points that you're making, first of all, the Chinese clearly are capable of democracy, and many Chinese do want democracy. I mean, the island of Taiwan is a perfect example where people speak Chinese. Many of them are culturally Chinese, most of them in some way or another, and they have a vigorous and flourishing democracy, which is really a model for the world. And there are people who've put their lives, who died, in Tiananmen to promote Chinese democracy. So I think they're totally capable of it. It's not something cultural or something that inhibits them from doing it, although it obviously is, in Confucian culture traditionally. And it's something that we can promote that's consistent with our values, that also does pose problems to the Communist Party, which does run the country. I don't think we should be shy about promoting democracy either there or abroad, but I think we need to be clear about where that goes in our order of priorities and our strategy. And I've written a bit about this, that I think we need to understand that this is not fundamentally an ideological contest. This is about essentially preventing this massive state, whatever its political complexion, from dominating Asia and being able to subject us to, coercion. And in a way, I actually think this is very consistent with the American ideal, because to me, the former Attorney General Barr actually put this quite well a year or so ago. He said the core of the American system is actually not really the Bill of Rights. The Soviet Union had a Bill of Rights. The core is the separation of powers. And it's the same logic here. We don't want any country or entity in the international system, just like at home, to be so powerful that it can do what it wants, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I think that's kind of the basic logic, this anti-hegemonic logic that we should be pursuing.
Well, in the point that I'm making, it's not that I don't believe philosophically in American democracy. I absolutely do. I believe that to my core.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking more in a practical sense, that if you engender these types of democratic, not for the end result of making China a democracy, but for the end result of making the Chinese Communist Party have to continually combat it on their home turf so they can't focus so exclusively externally. My point was really not necessarily about an overriding philosophical difference or battle between democracy and communism, but really in a practical sense, if they have to worry about their domestic issues, can't focus so much or as much on their international affairs.
Well, and that I completely agree with you. I mean, I think absolutely. And the democracy point is one. Another is, I mean, we should be promoting religious freedom. I mean, but that's something that the communists, suppress, or independent ethnic identity. I mean, they're trying to eliminate the Uyghurs as a, autonomous or independent sort of ethnic group. And so there are plenty of things that just by standing up for things that I think we believe in as a basic, that's a big problem for them by their own admission. They regard these things as mortal threats. The other thing I'd say, though, is, I do think that actually, I think the current administration, I think they are misconceiving. I mean, they talk about this as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think that's not the right way to frame this. I mean, it's more of a, because for a variety of reasons. I mean, one, I think it just misconceives what's fundamentally going on. So you're not likely to make good decisions if you don't understand, because it's someday we might need to make a deal with these guys, even if they're not authoritarian. My view is we got to get into a position where we're strong enough where they have to respect our interests. And then we can have a kind of a stable relationship where we're not going to trust them, but at least they'll respect their interests and those of our coalition partners. I also think we end up alienating a lot of countries that are important to us. I mean, if you look at a map of Asia, if you look at a map of Southeast and South Asia, there are no countries that are charted by the kind of prominent metrics as being fully free, So if it's a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, okay, maybe we've got like Iceland and the Netherlands on our side, but if we don't have like Vietnam or India or Thailand or Malaysia, well, that's not going to do us much good. So, and again, I'm not arguing with your point here at all. I'm just saying, this summit of democracies that the president is sponsoring, and they, I don't think that's the right way to frame this. That's not to say, again, that we can't promote democracy and that that's not strategically important and valuable, but it's to say, look, let's get our heads right about this, because the Chinese are too strong for us to have the wrong framework, because that's going to lead us to make bad decisions.
How problematic is the current warming of relations between China and Russia?
Very. I mean, it's very problematic because, Russia is, while a lot weaker than China and poorer than not as rich as China, it's very strong. It's very large. It has a very significant military capability, and it's very resolute. I mean, the Russians are really good at turning a low economic base into higher degree of, military power and political leverage. I mean, they're just willing to put a lot into the state, if you will, compared to, say, Germany. Look, who knows what they're going to do in Ukraine right now? And at the same time, the Chinese could take advantage of the situation and do something over there. So their ability to cooperate, even if only, indirectly, in two very different theaters causes huge problems, because we don't have enough, to the point we started with, we don't have the resources to cover down on everything by ourselves. And our allies are not pulling their weight, particularly in Europe and Japan. So it's a big problem. We should want a situation like what Nixon did to China. The problem is how to get there in a way that is tenable, geopolitically, politically, et cetera. Because, we and the Russians have a very bad state. But I mean, people say, we can't hope to peel off the Russians. Well, I think what's going to eventually peel off the Russians is they're going to see the Chinese as more of a threat than us. But the problem is, before we get there, a lot of bad things could happen that could make it, just make it things really worse all around.
Well, this is what I'm talking about, making that football analogy, as if the Russians and the Chinese are playing on our half of the field. We can't expect to run the same offense and think that it's going to change the field or give us a field advantage. I think we have to think completely outside the box. And the point that you made about the Russians eventually seeing the Chinese as a greater threat, That's a challenge because Putin came from that Cold War mentality, seeing the United States as almost the singular foe. So it's a challenge. But that's the one that I think we have to focus on. And wherever we can gain an advantage in that regard, I'd put resources there.
Well, we got to try to drive wedges between them, and remember that the Soviets deployed several 100,000 troops in the Russian Far East, Soviet Far East, to deal with the Chinese. They actually fought a border war, so there was not a lot of love lost. I think Putin himself, I think he clearly loathes us, but I mean, maybe future leaders around him who are a bit younger and kind of looking farther into the future might see things differently. But right now, we're not in a good place.
In regards to the Chinese cyber threat, if you look at the situation right now, it looks like we're incredibly far behind. Is there a necessity to put a tremendous amount of resources? You mentioned that we just can't throw resources at the problem, but if we threw resources at this cyber threat and start taking the fight in that regard to them, so it's not a hot war necessarily. This is one of those gray zone activities, but we really need to focus on that. At the beginning of the Cold War, the United States had a definite disadvantage in espionage. We were way behind the Soviets, but we caught up. I think that's where the resources, or at least in part, a good part of our resources need to go.
Yeah, I'm more concerned about the military balance because I don't think the gray zone at the end of the day is going to be where things are decided. The intelligence focus is important, and it does appear that the agency and others are apparently, they announced the formation of a China Mission Center, according to, I think, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So I think that's good, but I think the military balance is where we really need to worry, because if we leave that open, then the Chinese can escalate advantageously and make gains that we won't be able to reverse.
I agree about that. I think that, of course, if you have somebody who's aggressive like the Chinese are now, you have to be able to stand up to them militarily. But if we continue to fall behind in these cyber threats, that could be, in the future, we lose our advantage, our technological advantage, and that could be very detrimental.
Yeah, I mean, I think cyber is one of them. AI, space. There was an important article by Eric Schmidt and Graham Allison today in the Wall Street Journal, just pointing out how we're really being challenged by the Chinese on these kind of cutting edge fields of technology that are going to be so determinant of the future, both economically and militarily. So, we definitely. I mean, cyber is going to be just an inherent part of warfare as well as anything else in life in the future. So we gotta get ourselves in gear and just be out there competing.
Another thing I have a concern about, this is not a one-on-one comparison with the Cold War or anything like that, even though you might have a situation where you have two superpowers in the world again. Not that there wasn't political discord during the Cold War, but you could say Cold Warriors were Nixon. Elbridge A was a Cold Warrior, and so was the Kennedys. This situation that we have in domestic politics is detrimental to the situation as well.
Look, I think the point of our foreign policy should be to allow us to be able to have a free and vigorous domestic life. I mean, the point is to protect our domestic politics. On the other hand, we got to take account of reality and keep things in perspective. And obviously, things are quite polarized now. But I would say, on the other hand, also, look, things were pretty bad in the late 60s and 70s. I mean, crime wave, major, riots and cities burning down and social discord and general sense of, what did Nixon say? It was the pitiful giant kind of thing. And yet we came out of that and ended up winning the Cold War. So, I mean, there were a lot of troubles in the interwar period, certainly during the Depression, things were really bad. So I tend to think some of these things are exaggerated because the American military is still out there. We can still, we passed laws and we're still the currency of choice. I don't want to be sanguine. I think we need to be clear on what we're doing. But basically, there are two countries in the world that are really, really much more important than anybody else, and that's the U.S. and China. And I mean, I was getting some European, was telling me, the Americans and everything's, and that's like, I mean, Europe is currently about 25% of global GDP. According to the Europeans themselves, in 20 years, they're going to be 10%. So, I mean, look, I think we got to address our own problems for its own sake. I mean, as well as being able to compete internationally. But to me, what we want to come back to is what's in Americans' interests, our security, our freedom, and our prosperity. And that's going to be working out our problems on our own, but also being able to be strong enough to make sure others can't impose their will on us.
Well, how problematic is the economic power of China, because during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we had no economic dependence on the Soviet Union at all. They were almost completely isolated. That's not the case with China. So how does that complicate the situation?
It's certainly very significant. It cuts a couple different ways, though, because the Chinese are also vulnerable to us. So I'm not sure at the end of the day whether it makes us more vulnerable or them more vulnerable, or whether it makes war more or less likely. I mean, some people say, well, it's less likely because we're intertwined. But on the other hand, Great Britain and Germany were each other's biggest trading partners in 1914. And it also gives more causes for discord in the relationship. I mean, the Soviets and we didn't get into fights about our trading relationship because we didn't really have one. But it's something we got to be very careful of. I think we're going to need to selectively decouple particularly key industries and sort of areas that we don't want the Chinese to have leverage over us, or that are kind of military or security or just really critical, like PPE or pharmaceuticals. That's what we're going to have to do to make sure that they can't just like switch something off and bring us to our knees.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because the last thing I'd like to talk about is actually COVID. Mm-hmm. I think we missed a real opportunity. We expended a great deal of resources dealing with the pandemic, but what we could have done is become way more innovative. For example, throw some of that money into securing pharmaceutical factories and so forth, so we weren't so dependent on the Chinese. Do you think we missed an opportunity in how we use those resources to help pry away some of that dependence?
I mean, I think the jury is still out. I mean, I know there are provisions in the current National Defense Authorization Act, and I know there's a lot of discussion about potential ideas. But I think, to your point, it's important that we actually do something to try to move supply chains. I do get the sense things are shifting. I mean, it's hard to tell, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think people have now really seen the downsides of being so vulnerable to China in particular, and of just being so exposed. So hopefully that'll, and businesses, I think, must be factoring, and they certainly should be factoring more sense of risk into exposure to China in particular. But I think deliberate action by the Congress to, for instance, I know there's been discussion of like semiconductors, like trying to bring semiconductors manufacturing back to the United States. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's the kind of thing we should be really looking at. But there's a lot of agreement. But of course, just because there's agreement doesn't mean bills get passed.
Of course not.
So that's going to be the key, because, it gets injected in politics and people want to link it to other things. And that's sort of how our system, works. But I think it's going to be critical to keep the pressure on there.
And I don't mean to make the pandemic political or even become xenophobic or anything like that, but the Chinese are at fault for the pandemic.
Yeah, clearly.
If we continue to accentuate that, just make it clear that when situations or countries are dealing with problems with the pandemic, who is responsible for that? And you continue to reinforce that, because I agree with some of the premises in your book. I mean, this is a real competition,
right? And
we need to use everything at our advantage. As bad as the pandemic is, they're at fault. We're not.
Yeah. I mean, who knows what the origin of the pandemic was?
I'm not trying to become a conspiracy theorist. I'm not saying that they created in the Wuhan research facilities.
Well, I mean, there seems to be plenty of circumstantial evidence. It could very plausibly have been because of negligent behavior at the Wuhan lab that it was escaped. I don't see it as particularly plausible at all that they deliberately released it. But we can't know. I mean, if somebody resists, the Australians have said, let's have an independent investigation. The Chinese have resisted that. So okay, if you have nothing to hide, why don't you just let a real autonomous investigation do this? And even leaving that aside, their behavior in the early stages of the pandemic in particular, where they didn't share information and they were deceptive and deceitful, basically, clearly made, I think it's almost without question that it made the pandemic worse, or made us all more vulnerable to it. So, and I mean, I think people see China now, because it's not just, the pandemic's the most significant thing, but I mean, they've had border clashes with India. They're essentially waging an economic blockade on Australia right now. They're, using tremendous military force provocations around Taiwan. So, I mean, I think people kind of get the sense of what these guys are about. So the question will be whether we're smart and strategic and forward-leaning enough to get together.
So the last thing I have for you, what do you see then in the future, say in the next 5 years? We don't have to talk about 20 or 30 years in the future. Based on the trajectory that we're going right now, what do you see if we keep our same policy? And if we come up with some innovative solutions, where could we be?
Well, I think if we keep doing what we're doing, then China's probably going to be able to dominate Asia, and we're going to have to, we're going to be in a subordinate relationship. So, I mean, we're doing a lot better, but I think we got to keep accelerating, and I think we got to focus on Asia. And if we get Asia right, then, because that's the kind of the critical part of the world, we'll be able to figure the rest out. But it's going to take almost an extreme focus in the next coming years, and then we'll be able to be in a position where we can be more. And I also think we're going to need to go through a period of confrontation to be able to be in a strong enough position to be able to negotiate from a position of strength to China, and we're not there yet.
Well, I want to say the book is fascinating.
Thank you.
And it brings up an important topic for the United States and what we can face in the future. And I think there is an opportunity, as bad as we've been in the past, or as distracted might be a better word, as we've been in the past. If we focus our efforts, generally the United States, a focused United States does relatively well. So I want to thank you for your time, and I want to commend you for such a great work.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to join you and your listeners. So all the best. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
Bye-bye.
I would like to thank my guest, defense strategist and author Elbridge Colby. And if you would like to get his new book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, simply click on the link in the description below. Of the book, Jennifer Lind of Dartmouth College says, "The book is just a marvel of analytic clarity and ruthless logic, a true pleasure to read, and a marvel of clear argumentation and deductive reasoning. It cuts through a lot of the politics and uncertainty in a really helpful way." Our featured brew was Cold Snap White Ale from Samuel Adams. And if you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. All of the directories have an easy-to-use sharing function. If you want more information on the authors and the books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, where you can now listen to episodes in their entirety. The music was provided by the talented North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you would like to hear their new album, Beautiful Circle, just click on the link. It's in the description below as well. And finally, to the growing list of listeners from around the world, I can't say thank you enough. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
I see stiff competition with China. China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch.